When a single flower sparks suburban chaos, one woman's vendetta turns peaceful gardens into battlegrounds, and her allies. Fake HOA cops on a power trip. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where freshly cut lawns, hanging flower baskets, and white picket fences painted a picture of peace, a surprising source of tension emerged: tulips. For most residents, these colorful spring flowers were a welcome sign of warmth and community. Children picked them for Mother's Day, homeowners planted them in neat rows along fences, and neighbors often exchanged bulbs as friendly gestures. But for one resident, Karen, they were a problem. Not just a minor irritation, but a full-blown violation of what she believed to be the neighborhood standards. It began subtly. Karen, known by many for her overbearing attitude and obsession with order, started voicing concerns about unauthorized plantings along property lines. She argued that certain flower beds disrupted the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood and could attract pests. Her primary target was tulips, bright, innocent flowers that had never caused trouble before. To most, it sounded absurd, but Karen wasn't joking. She claimed they were too flamboyant, too chaotic, and disrupted the neutral, trimmed look she believed the block should maintain. Without any real authority, Karen began issuing warnings, handwritten notes tucked into mailboxes or taped to garden fences. They were phrased as if they were official: violation of Section 3A, front yard consistency, or non-compliant flora detected. No one knew where these so-called regulations came from, and when asked, Karen vaguely referenced guidelines she'd supposedly printed off from a now-defunct neighborhood Facebook group. The rules had never been discussed, approved, or enforced by anyone but her. The most baffling part was that no actual homeowners association, HOA, existed. The neighborhood had always operated informally. Residents maintained their properties out of mutual respect, not compulsion. But Karen insisted that an unspoken agreement had been broken. She referred to herself as a community standards advocate and even suggested that she was acting on behalf of an interim enforcement body, though no one else had heard of or participated in such a thing. At first, neighbors laughed it off. After all, who goes to war over tulips? But Karen doubled down. She started documenting alleged violations by taking photos of flower beds and circulating them in group texts she created without permission. Some homeowners received anonymous notes with vague threats such as, "Remove your non-compliant flora before further action is taken," or "Failure to comply may result in formal escalation." These messages arrived and signed, but everyone knew where they came from. Some neighbors tried to reason with her. One elderly woman who had maintained a tulip garden for years invited Karen over for tea, hoping to resolve the issue peacefully. Karen declined, replying with a note that said, "It's not personal, it's about principles." Another resident, a single dad who had recently taken up gardening as a stress reliever, received a printed list of acceptable flowers with tulips notably excluded. The list included oddly specific recommendations: white petunias, lavender in controlled amounts, and trimmed boxwood, none of which had ever been discussed or agreed upon by anyone else. What made the situation even more unsettling was how Karen framed her actions as noble. She claimed to be protecting the neighborhood's visual integrity and acting in the interest of property values. Her language became increasingly formal, often borrowing terminology from real HOA documentation she'd found online. This faux authoritative tone added to the confusion, especially for new residents who weren't sure whether these rules had any basis in reality. As her campaign escalated, Karen started identifying certain homes as repeat offenders. These were usually the ones with the most colorful or creative landscaping. Yard art garden flags and, of course, tulips were all targets. Some residents began receiving second and third warnings, each one more aggressive than the last. A few neighbors complied, not because they agreed, but because they didn't want drama. Others chose to ignore her completely, but that didn't stop her from continuing her one-woman mission. The absurdity of the situation began to strain neighborly relationships. Conversations that once revolved around weekend barbecues and lawn care now involved whispered frustrations and shared disbelief. A simple trip to the mailbox could mean spotting a new notice attached to your fence or an envelope with another fabricated violation. What was once a light-hearted, friendly environment started to feel tense and divided. Ironically, the tulips themselves flourished. Perhaps they became a quiet act of defiance, or maybe people just wanted to reclaim the joy of planting without fear of judgment. In a show of subtle resistance, more tulips began appearing around the block. A few residents planted them in unusual spots along curbs near stop signs, even in flower pots on porches, as if to say, "This is our neighborhood, too." Still, Karen was undeterred. She saw the increase in tulips not as a rejection of her authority, but as further proof of declining standards. Her complaints became more frequent and louder, eventually drawing the attention of residents who hadn't been directly involved before. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about flowers, it was about control, power, and the lengths one person would go to impose their version of order on everyone else. The neighborhood had a choice to make: ignore her and hope she'd give up, or start organizing a response. Either way, the war on tulips had been declared, and it was no longer a joke. Following the initial pushback against tulips, Karen escalated her efforts by forming what she claimed was a neighborhood enforcement group. Although the community had no official homeowners association, HOA, she insisted that one had always been unofficially in place and simply needed structure and representation. Under this justification, she assembled a small group of like-minded individuals, residents who shared her obsession with uniformity and control. These individuals began referring to themselves as the Neighborhood Standards Committee, a title they had created themselves, with no legal standing or community vote. The group's first order of business was to adopt the appearance of legitimacy. Members began wearing matching navy blue polo shirts embroidered with NSC, an acronym they claimed stood for the newly formed enforcement body. They also carried clipboards, issued printed notices, and frequently referred to fabricated regulations with official-sounding section numbers. These notices were styled to resemble real HOA documents, complete with watermarks, bullet points, and faux legal language. Many residents, especially newer ones, were initially unsure whether these documents held real authority. Karen's team began conducting walkthroughs of the neighborhood, slowly pacing through streets, peering over fences, and taking photos of front lawns. They claimed these inspections were for the purpose of compliance reviews. Their self-appointed mission was to preserve the visual harmony of the neighborhood, which they believed was being jeopardized by non-standard flowers, garden decorations, and lawn arrangements. During these walks, they would mark certain homes as needing corrective action, and homeowners would later find printed citations taped to their doors or fences. One of the group's tactics was the liberal use of terminology borrowed from actual HOA policies found online. Citations reference things like aesthetic zoning violations, unauthorized plant placement, and nonconforming landscape designs. These phrases, though meaningless in a legal sense, created the illusion of official power. The group even created a list of approved plant varieties, heavily favoring plain shrubs and neutral-colored flowers, while excluding tulips entirely. This list was circulated as a PDF via unsolicited emails and slipped under doors as part of a so-called spring compliance package. The group's activities quickly turned invasive. Several residents reported being photographed without consent while working in their yards. Some claimed that Karen and her cohorts had measured the height of flower beds and lawn edges with tape measures. These exaggerated inspections blurred the line between neighborhood involvement and harassment. While some neighbors initially found the behavior laughable, others began to feel uncomfortable and even intimidated. Despite having no legal authority, the group operated with confidence. They frequently cited non-existent bylaws and referenced an imaginary architectural review board. When challenged by skeptical homeowners, Karen and her team responded defensively, claiming that they were simply enforcing long-standing community values. At one point, they began issuing notices that included threats of fines, again, without any legal foundation. The documents stated that repeated offenses could result in $50 to $100 penalties, which were to be paid to a neighborhood beautification fund managed solely by Karen. Several residents pushed back by asking for documentation showing the legal formation of the HOA. Karen deflected these requests, claiming that official papers were pending registration or in progress. When pressed further, she would reference vague documents or say the group was operating under provisional authority. None of these claims could be substantiated. In reality, no legal entity had ever been created, no board had been elected, and no bylaws had ever been adopted. The confusion caused by these fake authorities began to erode trust within the community. Homeowners who hadn't received citations began wondering whether they were next. Others, who didn't fully understand the legal structure of HOAs, assumed they had somehow missed a critical meeting or document. The spread of misinformation was so effective that even a few otherwise skeptical residents hesitated to challenge the group for fear of being penalized or ostracized. What gave Karen's group its initial momentum was the appearance of order. The uniforms, paperwork, and official-sounding language masked the lack of actual authority. Many people are conditioned to respect what looks like power, even when it has no substance. This psychological tactic worked, at least temporarily, giving the group enough credibility to continue operating unchallenged by local institutions or law enforcement. However, cracks started to appear as more residents began comparing notes. People realized that citations varied wildly from house to house, and that the language used was inconsistent and often grammatically incorrect. Some homeowners discovered that the names and signatures on the warnings didn't match any known residents. Others realized that the email address listed for appeals or inquiries was just a generic Gmail account created by Karen. These inconsistencies fueled skepticism, and discussions about the fake HOA began circulating on neighborhood forums and group chats. At the same time, residents began digging into local laws and found that nothing Karen's group was doing had any legal weight. There were no local ordinances supporting their actions, and there was no mechanism to enforce fines or impose rules. The discovery that the entire HOA enforcement effort was a fabrication shocked many, but also sparked a shift in attitude. What had once been seen as a mild annoyance or quirky behavior was now viewed as a serious overreach. The fake HOA's foundation, built entirely on perception and fear, was beginning to crumble. Karen and her team had tried to impose a vision of uniformity and control without consensus legality or respect for others. Their power wasn't rooted in law or agreement. It was based on the assumption that no one would question them. But now the questions were starting, and the community was no longer content to stay silent. With the fake HOA now acting like a legitimate authority, Karen and her self-appointed committee grew bolder in their tactics. What had started as passive-aggressive notes and flower-based nitpicking quickly evolved into a full-blown campaign of micromanagement, surveillance, and psychological pressure. Their actions crossed from simply annoying to increasingly invasive and borderline harassment. One of the most notable developments was the obsession with documenting every so-called violation. Members of the group began patrolling the neighborhood more frequently, now armed not only with clipboards but with smartphones and cameras. They openly took photos and videos of front yards, flower beds, and homeowners during yard work. These images were then compiled into digital incident logs, which they claimed were necessary for record-keeping. Despite multiple complaints from residents about the invasive nature of the surveillance, the group insisted it was standard protocol for any HOA, which, again, didn't exist. To reinforce their illusion of authority, the fake HOA began issuing escalating written notices. These documents were more aggressive in tone than before and came with increasingly dramatic language, citing offenses such as willful noncompliance, continued landscaping misconduct, and intentional disregard for aesthetic regulations. The notices were formatted to appear formal, complete with pseudo-legal language, fabricated clause numbers, and even stamped infractions printed in red ink for visual impact. The group began referencing a 3-strike policy with vague threats of further action if homeowners didn't comply. Some of the cited violations bordered on the absurd. Residents were accused of having flower beds that were too vibrant, mulch that was inconsistent with block color schemes, and garden decorations deemed excessively whimsical. One household received a warning because their solar-powered garden lights were considered aesthetic disturbances after dark. Another was reprimanded for having a bird feeder that supposedly encouraged uncontrolled wildlife traffic. It became increasingly clear that the group's judgments were not based on any community consensus or written guideline, but rather on their personal preferences and biases. To give their operation a deeper sense of legitimacy, the fake HOA created a printed neighborhood compliance handbook. This 12-page document was distributed in manila envelopes and stuffed into mailboxes without warning. It featured a list of banned items, mandatory landscaping expectations, and diagrams of ideal yard layouts. Notably, the document had no publication date, no author attribution, and no legal references. Still, the group demanded that residents acknowledge receipt and sign an attached agreement to comply. Many homeowners immediately disregarded the package, but a few, uncertain or intimidated, signed the forms without realizing they had no binding power. Alongside paperwork came a physical shift in enforcement. The group began placing small orange flags in front yards they considered to be in pre-violation status. These flags, which looked like utility markers, were labeled with acronyms and cryptic codes like VC1A or GCR. When questioned about their meaning, Karen claimed they were internal codes for visual categorization. For affected residents, the flags felt like public shaming tools designed to single them out and embarrass them into compliance. The fake HOA also experimented with creating a financial pressure system. Some notices started including alleged fine amounts for continued noncompliance, typically ranging from $25 to $100. These amounts were to be donated to the so-called Neighborhood Aesthetic Reserve Fund, which was nothing more than a vague concept without a bank account or oversight. The notices claimed that failure to pay might result in further administrative escalation, though they never clarified what that actually entailed. Unsurprisingly, no one who received a fine ever paid it, but the intent behind the threat was clear. To further intimidate residents, Karen and her group began using symbolic gestures of control. Some properties received laminated final notice tags on their fences or mailboxes. Others were added to a public watch list that was circulated among group members and, in some cases, shown to other residents as a warning. This list included photos of yards, homeowner names, and alleged offenses, creating a blacklist that violated basic privacy and community trust. The absurdity of the group's behavior began to draw more attention and concern. Simple landscaping choices were now being treated like criminal offenses. The group's interpretation of what was acceptable grew more narrow with each passing week. At one point, they even distributed color swatches that residents were encouraged to follow when selecting garden plants, favoring muted greens, whites, and blues, while discouraging bright reds, oranges, and pinks. While many residents laughed at the absurdity, the psychological toll began to wear on others. Elderly homeowners, new residents, and families with limited time or resources felt the stress of being targeted. Several considered removing their gardens altogether just to avoid the harassment. A few even started posting no trespassing signs to keep the enforcers from stepping onto their property for inspections. The overall atmosphere of the neighborhood changed. Conversations became cautious, front yard interactions more tense, and group chats filled with confusion, jokes, and frustration about the bizarre enforcement campaign. The fake HOA strategy had created a climate of fear and paranoia all over tulips, lawn ornaments, and personal expression. Despite all of this, Karen and her group believed they were improving the community. They saw their actions as a noble effort to raise standards and enforce respectable living conditions. But what they had really created was a landscape of anxiety, division, and resentment. As their petty power plays intensified, so did the resistance forming quietly among their neighbors, laying the groundwork for a unified response. As the fake HOA's enforcement tactics became increasingly aggressive and absurd, the neighborhood's patience wore thin. What started as confusion and mild annoyance transformed into frustration and anger. Slowly, residents who had initially stayed quiet or laughed off the notices began to realize that ignoring Karen's group would not be enough. If left unchecked, the harassment would only intensify. The community understood that a coordinated response was necessary to reclaim their autonomy and peace. The first signs of rebellion appeared through subtle acts of defiance. Homeowners who had previously removed their tulips out of fear or pressure began replanting them in greater numbers. Some purchased new bulbs specifically to make a statement, filling their yards, planters, and window boxes with an explosion of colorful tulips. Bright reds, yellows, purples, and pinks popped up everywhere, creating a vivid contrast to the dull color palette that Karen's fake HOA tried to enforce. It became clear that tulips were no longer just flowers. They had become a symbol of resistance. In addition to planting more tulips, residents found creative ways to mock and undermine the fabricated regulations. Yard decorations featuring exaggerated displays of tulips, giant inflatable flowers, and signs with slogans like Tulip Freedom or Flower Power Zone began appearing. Some homeowners created mock citations of their own, printing humorous violations and taping them to each other's doors with fake charges, such as excessive happiness and unauthorized beauty. Laughter and a sense of unity replaced the earlier feelings of intimidation. Beyond individual acts of defiance, organized efforts emerged. A group of neighbors formed an informal committee dedicated to challenging Karen's fake HOA. They created a private online group to share updates, organize responses, and document every interaction with the so-called enforcers. They compared the fake notices they had received, exposing the inconsistencies, grammatical errors, and recycled templates used by Karen's team. This pooling of information helped residents better understand the lack of any legal basis behind the citations. The group also took proactive measures to educate the broader community. They compiled a simple fact sheet outlining the legal requirements for forming a real HOA, highlighting that no such procedures had ever been followed in their neighborhood. This document clarified that homeowners could not be fined, cited, or controlled by any unofficial group. Printed copies were discreetly distributed door-to-door, and digital versions were circulated via email and neighborhood messaging apps. Some residents reached out to local officials to seek guidance. After confirming that Karen's group had no legal authority, they shared this information publicly. With official backing, more homeowners felt confident, openly defying the fake HOA's demands without fear of consequences. The myth of Karen's authority began to crumble rapidly once the truth was exposed. In an even bolder move, the informal resistance group organized a neighborhood-wide event called the Tulip Festival. It was designed not only to celebrate their community spirit, but also to deliver a direct message to the fake HOA. On the day of the festival, homeowners decorated their yards with tulips, flower garlands, colorful banners, and signs championing individuality and freedom. Some residents wore tulip-themed clothing, and children set up lemonade stands adorned with drawings of bright flowers. The atmosphere was festive, joyful, and defiantly inclusive. The Tulip Festival served multiple purposes. It publicly humiliated Karen's group by showcasing the neighborhood's overwhelming unity against them. It also drew attention from neighboring communities and local media outlets, further undermining the fake HOA's credibility. Photos from the event circulated widely online, with captions mocking the absurdity of the situation and praising the residents' creativity and spirit. The fake HOA's attempts to maintain control after the festival were largely ineffective. Karen and her team continued issuing notices, but few took them seriously anymore. Some residents even framed the fake citations and displayed them as trophies of resistance. The sight of homeowners openly laughing at their threats caused morale within the fake enforcement group to collapse. Several of Karen's recruits quietly withdrew from the operation, unwilling to face further public embarrassment or confrontation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's bonds grew stronger. Former strangers became allies as they shared experiences, resources, and support. New friendships formed over common gardens, mutual aid efforts, and group projects to beautify the community on their own terms, not according to any imposed standards. This sense of togetherness proved far more powerful than any manufactured set of rules. By refusing to comply, mocking the petty demands, and reclaiming control over their own homes, The residents had successfully neutralized the threat posed by the fake HOA. Their rebellion did not rely on aggression or escalation, but on unity, humor, creativity, and knowledge. The tulips that once served as the symbol of conflict had transformed into emblems of resilience and community pride. Karen's influence continued to diminish as the reality of her powerless position became undeniable. Her attempts to assert control had backfired spectacularly, serving only to galvanize a stronger, more connected, and more determined neighborhood. What she had tried to suppress, the colorful, diverse, and free-spirited character of the community, had blossomed more vibrantly than ever before. The collapse of Karen's influence was not sudden, but rather a gradual and inevitable unraveling driven by the community's persistence, humor, and unity. Her attempts to maintain the illusion of authority crumbled under the weight of public exposure and growing resistance. What she had tried to build, a fabricated system of control, proved no match for a neighborhood determined to protect its freedom and individuality. The turning point came when formal complaints about harassment and privacy violations were filed with local authorities. Several homeowners documented Karen's group's activities, compiling photographic and video evidence of trespassing, intimidation, and unauthorized distribution of false legal documents. The evidence painted a clear picture of a rogue group impersonating an official entity, which alarmed both the police and local regulatory agencies. Although the authorities concluded that no major crimes had been committed, they issued stern warnings about impersonating legal organizations and engaging in harassment. Karen was formally ordered to cease all activities related to the fake HOA, including the distribution of citations, the collection of fake fines, and the operation of so-called compliance patrols. She was warned that any further attempts to present herself or her group as an official authority would result in legal consequences. The neighborhood finally had official, documented confirmation that Karen's group had no power, and Karen had no choice but to step back publicly. The exposure triggered a chain reaction within her shrinking group of supporters. Many of those who had joined her out of fear, loyalty, or confusion now realized they had been misled. Feeling embarrassed and betrayed, they abandoned the operation, some even issuing public apologies to their neighbors. Without backup, Karen found herself increasingly isolated, her credibility in ruins. The very community she had tried to dominate now viewed her not as a leader, but as a cautionary example of how power, when built on lies and fear, inevitably collapses. Karen attempted to defend herself, blaming the ungratefulness of the neighborhood and accusing residents of lacking pride in their community. However, her words found no sympathetic audience. Her credibility was irreparably damaged, and no amount of deflection could undo the reality that she had manufactured authority out of nothing and abused it to bully others. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more she alienated herself. Invitations to block parties, neighborhood chats, and social events dried up completely. She became a pariah in the very community she had once sought to control. While Karen's downfall was both dramatic and complete, the spirit of the neighborhood thrived. What had started as a defensive movement against petty authoritarianism blossomed into a positive, ongoing celebration of individuality and unity. The tulips that had once been a target of disdain now became the official symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. Residents embraced the flower's symbolism wholeheartedly. Tulip-themed flags were designed and displayed proudly in front yards. Community-wide gardening days were organized where neighbors helped one another plant, maintain, and expand their gardens. Some families created tulip murals, while children painted colorful flower designs on sidewalks and fences with chalk. The tulip was no longer just a flower. It was a reminder that standing up against unjust control could yield beautiful results. A few proactive neighbors proposed hosting an annual Tulip Day to commemorate their victory. The idea quickly gained widespread support, and plans were made to hold a yearly festival celebrating not only the tulips themselves, but also the ideals of freedom, creativity, and community cooperation. Booths, games, contests, and music were organized around the themes of gardens, flowers, and neighborhood pride. The event promised to transform what had once been a tense and fearful environment into a lasting tradition of joy and togetherness. The neighborhood also took more formal steps to ensure that such an abuse of power could never happen again. An official residents association was discussed, not to impose rules, but to provide a legitimate forum for open communication, mutual support, and community events. Unlike Karen's fake HOA, this association would operate transparently with elected members' voluntary participation and clearly defined and limited responsibilities. The goal was to strengthen community bonds while protecting individual freedoms. Beyond the neighborhood itself, the story of Karen's downfall and the Tulip Rebellion spread online, resonating with people across various communities who had experienced similar power struggles. The neighborhood became a small but inspiring symbol of how ordinary people could resist pettiness, manipulation, and fear by coming together with humor, resilience, and unity. In the end, Karen's attempt to enforce conformity only strengthened the neighborhood's diversity. The wide range of colors, garden styles, and decorations that now adorned the street stood as a living testament to the value of individuality. Every tulip that bloomed was a quiet but powerful act of defiance, a reminder that even the smallest and simplest things, like a flower, could carry the weight of resistance against control. The legacy of the conflict was not bitterness, but pride. Residents took satisfaction in knowing they had faced down unjust authority not with anger or violence, but with creativity, solidarity, and persistence. They had proven that a community built on trust and respect would always be stronger than one built on fear and intimidation. As spring returned each year and the tulips began to bloom again, the neighborhood would remember they had fought for their right to plant, to express, and to live freely, and they had won. For more unbelievable neighborhood dramas and real-life showdowns, subscribe now to expect stories.